The nuclear crisis in Iran, especially the one that erupted in June 2025, had actually been brewing since late 2024. After a shift in the Syrian conflict, the military balance of power between Iran and Israel began to tilt dangerously. Previously, Iran had been backing Hezbollah in northern Israel and Hamas in the south, supplying them with hundreds of thousands of cheap missiles. This essentially became a sword of Damocles hanging over Israel's head. In the event of conflict, this Daesh missile belt could rain rockets on Israeli cities, overwhelming the Iron Dome defense system. But once that missile belt collapsed, the balance of power flipped. The offensive and defensive sides were reversed. On one hand, Syria's air defense was destroyed, allowing Israeli jets to fly directly into Iranian territory and drop inexpensive bombs. On the other hand, without its proxy forces, Iran was left with only costly medium-range ballistic missiles if it wanted to strike Israel. In this long-distance exchange of fire, Iran was clearly at a disadvantage. Once its missiles were launched, they couldn't be recalled. To shift the unfavorable geopolitical landscape, Iran accelerated its nuclear program at the beginning of 2025. According to the International Atomic Energy Agency, IAEA, by May, Iran had stockpiled over 400 kilograms of uranium enriched to 60%. In theory, that's enough to build up to 10 nuclear warheads. However, Iran remains divided internally on its nuclear policy. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, IRGC, advocates for nuclear weapons as a means of securing assets and ensuring national independence. Meanwhile, Iran's civilian government believes that neither the US nor Russia is in a position or has the motivation to launch a full-scale invasion of Iran. Instead, the civilian leaders hope to use the nuclear program as a bargaining chip to pressure the US into lifting economic sanctions in exchange for regime stability. Although their goals differ, both factions have chosen to pursue the same path. So what does this crisis reveal about the geopolitical chessboard involving the US, Russia, China, and Israel? Let's find out, right here on Facts 360 TV. Israel's vulnerable position in the face of a nuclear-armed Iran. During the Iran-Israel conflict in June 2025, Israel may have had tactical advantages, but was strategically cornered. Although Israel's conventional weapons were more advanced, if Iran were to go nuclear, Israel would lose the upper hand. Even though Israel also possesses nuclear weapons, it's a small country. 40% of its population lives in the Tel Aviv metropolitan area. That makes it an easy and obvious target. In contrast, Iran is vast, and its major cities are scattered and often home to opposition groups. Ironically, in the event of nuclear war, Iran's theocratic regime might actually become more stable. The two nations are thus facing completely different types of threats. Naturally, the United States doesn't want Iran to acquire nuclear weapons either. Initially, Trump hoped that extreme sanctions would force Iran into submission. But in February 2025, US-Russia relations began to thaw. With Russia acting as mediator, Trump restarted negotiations over Iran's nuclear program, trying to persuade Tehran to voluntarily abandon its ambitions. Russia's involvement. Why is Russia intervening in Iran's affairs? On one hand, ever since the Russia-Ukraine war began, Iran has provided Moscow with large quantities of drones. The two countries even signed a comprehensive strategic partnership agreement. On the other hand, with Finland and Turkey drifting closer to the west, Russia has been losing access to the Baltic and Black Seas. To counter this, Moscow built the North-South Economic Corridor, linking the Caspian Sea through Iran to the Indian Ocean. India buys cheap Russian oil and resells it to Europe at a profit, pleasing the West while helping Russia maintain its budget. This is one reason why Iran-India ties have warmed recently, thanks to Russian support. If Iran collapses, Russia could lose its gateway to the Indian Ocean, a risk Putin cannot accept. For this reason, Russia actively mediates between the US and Iran, trying to hand Trump a political win in exchange for reduced US support for Ukraine. In April, Trump relaunched nuclear talks with Iran and pressured Israel to delay its planned airstrike in May. However, after 5 rounds of negotiations, no agreement was reached. Trump and the ambition behind Iran Deal 2.0. Back in 2018, under pressure from Gulf oil producers, Trump tore up the Iran nuclear deal JCPOA 1.0 signed by Obama. Now Trump wants a tougher version, Iran nuclear deal 2.0, to prove to his conservative base that he's a stronger leader than Obama. Trump set 2 conditions for Iran. First, Iran must not retain any enriched uranium. Second, it must dismantle all centrifuges. The first demand could be negotiated. Iran is willing to store its enriched uranium in Russia under international supervision, allowing Russia to act as a neutral arbiter. If the US breaks the deal, Iran could reclaim its stockpile. That's why Russia holds such sway in these talks. But the second demand, removing all centrifuges, was a red line for Iran. If Iran gives up its uranium enrichment capability and the US tears up the agreement again, Iran would be left defenseless. From Tehran's perspective, America's volatile political system, where parties constantly undermine each other, means any deal signed with one administration could be voided by the next. Once betrayed, Iran has no desire to repeat its past mistake. Faced with Tehran's tough stance, Trump had 3 options. First, compromise and allow Iran to retain a small amount of low-enriched uranium. Second, launch a military strike to destroy Iran's nuclear facilities. Or third, initiate regime change, topple the government, and install a pro-Western regime. While the first option sounds simple, it closely resembles Obama's original model. If Trump chose this path, he wouldn't be able to justify it to voters. Worse yet, it would signal weakness, encouraging other nations to demand more in future trade deals. And Trump is not known for easy compromises. He only negotiates when all else fails. The third option, regime change, offers the biggest strategic gain, but it's also the least feasible. Unlike Syria, Iran's opposition lacks any armed force, making a swift takeover through violence nearly impossible. Though Iran's leadership is facing both internal and external pressure, they still enjoy solid support from about 40% of the population, mainly conservatives. This conservative base remains the backbone of the regime. Iran's power base lies in the rural areas, where the silent majority opposes a return to secular governance. This is very different from Syria, where a minority Alawite government ruled over a Sunni majority with foreign backing. So there are only 2 realistic scenarios for regime collapse in Iran. First, a deep political divide in Tehran, similar to the August 19th coup in the USSR, where reformists and hardliners clash so severely that local factions rise to power. However, this is highly unlikely unless Supreme Leader Khamenei dies, triggering a succession crisis. But if the US and Israel were to attempt an assassination, it could backfire, leading to the election of an even more hardline leader. Second option, the US launches a ground invasion like it did in Iraq to remove Saddam Hussein. But the US no longer has the capability or will for such a mission. America's primary rival now is China. Getting bogged down in another Middle Eastern war would only benefit China and Russia. Furthermore, like in post-invasion Iraq, the collapse of Iran could lead to the resurgence of the Daesh belt. A weakened Iran could also empower Turkey, potentially becoming a more unpredictable US adversary. So, while the US and Israel repeatedly threaten to overthrow Iran's regime, these are empty threats with limited feasibility and little deterrent value for Tehran. Khamenei has already appointed a successor who shares his worldview, much like how Trump chose Vance as his running mate, making assassinations strategically meaningless. US airstrikes meant to force talks. Since Trump wouldn't compromise at the negotiating table and couldn't escalate through regime change, he was left with one path: launching limited airstrikes on Iran's nuclear facilities to push for a peace deal. But Iran had long been preparing for this. They moved large numbers of centrifuges and enriched uranium into underground facilities buried hundreds of meters deep. Due to the Non-Proliferation Treaty, NPT, the US cannot legally provide strategic bombers to Israel. The Israeli Air Force mostly uses fighters like the F-15, F-16, and F-35, optimized for air superiority but with limited ground strike capability. In fact, Iran has been preparing for a potential Israeli strike for over 6 months. Many of their centrifuges and enriched uranium reserves are now stored in underground bunkers shielded by thick concrete. To destroy such deep targets, only the US B-2 bomber carrying heavy bunker buster bombs is suitable. But that requires flying at altitudes of tens of thousands of feet and dropping 2 to 3 bombs precisely on the same coordinate. A mission with high risk and low odds of success. If the US military successfully destroys Iran's nuclear infrastructure, then a formal deal becomes less urgent, as Iran would be unable to continue nuclear development in the short term. But if the strikes fail to destroy those underground sites, Trump may be forced to return to a modified Obama-era deal, allowing Iran to retain low-level enrichment capabilities. Facing a US airstrike threat, Iran has 2 choices. First, concede at the negotiating table and sign a denuclearization agreement. Second, absorb the airstrike and gauge its outcome. If the damage is extensive, they may be willing to compromise. If the strike fails, they will maintain a firm stance. Rather than dismantling its centrifuges voluntarily, Iran prefers to gamble that US bunker-busting bombs won't succeed. Because in the worst-case scenario, Iran would still only lose its enrichment capacity passively, not by choice. After the US strike, Iran will calibrate its response based on the actual damage. If most centrifuges are destroyed, Iran may opt for symbolic retaliation, like launching a missile strike on US bases in the Middle East, while signaling in advance to avoid escalation. After saving face, Iran could return to talks and accept a US condition to halt all uranium enrichment. If the airstrike fails, proving US bombs can't reach Iran's underground sites, the advantage swings to Tehran. Iran may then accelerate nuclear development, following North Korea's path to nuclear deterrence. Or it might blockade the Strait of Hormuz, sending oil prices and global inflation soaring, forcing Trump to backtrack and accept a deal similar to Obama's, allowing limited enrichment. However, any strategy Iran chooses remains a double-edged sword. Such actions would seriously damage Iran's relations with Gulf countries and the European Union. According to recent reports, the US airstrike appears to have been highly effective. The underground Fordow nuclear facility, which once housed around 3,000 centrifuges, is likely destroyed, and other major nuclear sites were also heavily targeted. Lacking centrifuges, Iran no longer has the short-term capability to produce nuclear weapons, effectively leaving it without leverage, forcing it to consider restrained retaliation. The US airstrikes destroyed Iran's nuclear infrastructure, stripping Tehran of its bargaining chip. Thus, Iran is left with no viable option but to negotiate. With its uranium enrichment capacity eliminated, Iran is at a disadvantage in continuing long-range attacks on Israel. Each Iron Dome interceptor used by Israel costs hundreds of thousands of dollars, while each medium-range ballistic missile launched by Iran costs millions and lacks accuracy. If a missile hits a civilian area, it could only unify Israeli public opinion further. Without US intervention, Israel, with air superiority, would gladly prolong the conflict to further weaken Iran. Looking ahead, Iran needs a dignified exit, a way to show it hasn't completely lost to the US and Israel. At the right moment, Iran may restart negotiations with the US, trading its nuclear program for the lifting of sanctions. Both Iran and the US want a deal. Iran seeks sanction relief to stabilize its regime, as prolonged poverty will only grow public dissatisfaction. Meanwhile, the US wants to pivot away from the Middle East and focus on its Indo-Pacific strategy. Total collapse of Iran isn't in America's core interest, since that could allow Turkey to rise as a regional superpower, creating a new unpredictable challenger for Washington. 20 years ago, the world saw a unipolar moment where the US stood at its peak, confident and dominant. In Europe, the US expanded NATO eastward, inviting Ukraine and Georgia to join. In the Middle East, it launched 2 major wars and moved deep into Central Asia. With its maritime dominance, the US even sought control over land-based power centers. But now, with Trump back in the White House, his foreign policy aims to reconcile with America's 2 major rivals, Russia and Iran, while downsizing US strategy in Eastern Europe and Western Asia. The future US defense perimeter may shift toward Western Europe and oil-producing nations in the Gulf. This especially includes the Gulf Cooperation Council, GCC, Saudi Arabia, UAE, Qatar, Kuwait, Oman, and Bahrain, home to the US Fifth Fleet. The new strategic focus will be on tech and energy control. That might mean partial abandonment of Israel by Washington. This is why Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu staunchly opposes any US-Iran reconciliation. In East Asia, with China's anti-access area denial, A2/AD capability growing, the US is also considering retreating from the first island chain to the second island chain. In recent years, the US has moved part of its Okinawa forces to Guam, staying out of range of China's DF-17 hypersonic missiles and preparing for a potential surprise attack in the event of war. This rapid resolution of Iran's nuclear crisis shattered Russia's hope to sit back and benefit from prolonged chaos. Oil prices have briefly recovered, but not enough to offset Russia's deep fiscal deficits. Moreover, US air defense systems originally given to Israel to counter drones may soon be redirected to the Ukrainian front. Since Trump's return to the global stage, through pressure or diplomacy, Russia and Ukraine have held 2 rounds of negotiations and reached tentative agreements. Ukraine is reportedly willing to cede 4 eastern provinces in exchange for allowing European forces to deploy in the West. However, both sides still disagree on how to define the territories. Ukraine wants to keep the current control lines and ceasefire immediately, while Russia demands full control over all 4 provinces, including areas currently held by Ukraine. It wants Ukraine to withdraw from Donetsk and surrender the strategic twin cities in Donbass. In the coming months, Russia and Ukraine will likely continue a strategy of fight and negotiate, aiming to strengthen their position at the table. There's now a 50% plus chance of a ceasefire being reached in the second half of this year. Looking further ahead, as the US slowly steps away from global hot zones, regions like Eastern Europe, the Crescent Zone stretching from the Levant to the Persian Gulf and Central Asia may become vast power vacuums. There, mid-tier powers like Russia, Germany, Turkey, Iran, Saudi Arabia, and India will compete for influence, ushering in a chaotic era reminiscent of the Warring States period in ancient history. And that concludes our perspective here at Facts 360 TV. What are your thoughts on these geopolitical shifts? Share your views with Facts 360 TV in the comments below. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to support the channel. I'm Eddie. See you next time.